Pagans call this the wheel of the year. The 8 festivals which mark the passing of the seasons. 4 solar festivals, sabbats. The winter solstice, or Yule, which happens on either the 21st or 22nd of December. Ostara, Easter, 21st or 22nd normally. The summer solstice, midsummer, or Litha, on the 21st or 22nd of June. And the autumn equinox, harvest, or Mabon, which is September 21st to 2nd. And there are also the 4 festivals of fire, the so-called cross-quarter days. Imbolc, 1st or 2nd of February. Beltane, 1st of May. Lugnas, or Lammas, which is considered a harvest festival, 1st or 2nd of August. And Samhain, Halloween, which is, of course, October 31st. Pagans will tell you that these festivals have been celebrated consistently since Christianity, although sometimes disguising their intent by adopting or being co-opted by the church. On these days, pagans celebrate not only the eternally turning wheel of the seasons, but also their deep connection to the land, their ancestors, and their history. It is a belief system with great beauty and spiritual insight. What it isn't is ancient, historically accurate, or in most senses of the word, authentic. The immediate ancestor of modern paganism, Druidry, was pretty much invented wholesale by Romantic poets and historians in the 17th to 19th centuries. Paganism as we know it today is partly a derivation of inaccurate Victorian and early 20th century historical and anthropological theories, mixed in with a sizable amount of plagiarism of the works of the notorious occultist Aleister Crowley, and then filled out with sources both speculative and, in many cases, explicitly fictional. It would take a far longer talk than this one to delineate the origins of modern paganism fully, especially the ritualized form which has come to be known as Wicca. If you're interested in more details about that, I highly recommend the work of Professor Ronald Hutton, who literally wrote the book on the subject, which is called The Triumph of the Moon. Hutton, a second-generation pagan and historian, has great belief in the spirituality of the belief system, but no truck with the often speculative and occasionally downright shoddy history taken as read by most of its adherents. Hutton has said, "The real danger is the idea that all customs, indeed all superstitions, nursery rhymes, and anything that smacks of folkiness, are direct survivals of ancient pagan fertility rites, and are concerned with the appeasement of gods and spirits. Although the suggestion of an ancient origin for our folklore was the central tenet of the Victorian and Edwardian pioneers of folklore collection, this notion has become generally known only in the last 40 years or so, and has taken hold with astonishing rapidity. The majority of the population now carry the virus in one form or another, and some are very badly infected. The problem here is not simply that these theories are unsupported by any evidence, but that their blanket similarity destroys any individuality. All customs will soon end up with the same story." To cut a long story short, the surviving folklore of our country and our range of beautiful weathered monuments and standing stones, those that survived the deprivations of the weather, political and religious turmoils from the original conversion of the island to the Civil War, inspired many historians, especially of a Welsh nationalistic bent, to dream of a past time where the white-robed Druid priesthood worshipped the sun and the moon. These fantasies, in the old sense of the word, of course, affected their interpretation of history, and in a time before the organised forms of archaeology we take for granted now, they had little hard data to work with. By the time these tales were repeated and enhanced and reached the Victorian folklorists, an extra layer of supposed fertility rites had been attached to several of the celebrations, especially to May Day and Midsummer. If what you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And if what you have is a sexually repressed upper-class Victorian folklorist, everything starts to look like a fertility theory. By the mid-20th century, two people took what had come before and combined them into a single set of beliefs. One was a former Far Eastern civil servant and enthusiastic pursuer of non-Christian beliefs, Gerald Gardner. Following his return from his service, Gardner settled in the New Forest. While there, he joined several occult organisations, including Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis, and also claimed to have been a member of a New Forest coven, which claimed a long-standing pre-Christian origin, what we would now call hereditary witchcraft. Beyond Gardner's claims, we don't know that much about this coven. We do know that when Gardner founded his own coven, it bore striking resemblances to the ritual structures of the OTO, which in turn came from the part Masonic, part Druidry-inspired rites of the Victorian Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The other strong resemblance it had was to a version of European history straight out of the recently published work of Margaret Murray, who had proposed not only the survival of a pre-Christian, female-centred pagan belief system, which survived in the majority of Western Europe, but also the 8 holy days we just saw at the start. Her evidence was sparse and flawed, and her theory heavily romanticised. But it captured the imagination of many who were reeling from the twin blows of the loss of general Christian faith post-Darwin and the brutality of the First World War, which also saw a rise in an interest in spirituality and other worlds. It also found favour with the rising feminist movement, offering a spiritual position where the female was not only venerated, but considered as at least equal, and often superior to, the male impulse codified by Christianity. Gardner and his coven members initiated a whole generation of leaders and worshippers into what would become known as Gardnerian Wicca. These interests spread across the West, finding a lot of interest and support in the United States, especially towards the end of the 1950s and the start of the 60s. It was here that modern paganism took on key aspects which still inform it today, several of which were explicitly either invented at the time or drew from actual fiction. A vital part of this phase began as a group of young high school students and college students in Fulton, Missouri, including Lance Christie and Tim Zell, who later changed his name to Oberon Zell Ravenheart, a man who has truly taken to heart the role he feels his religious beliefs have asked of him. Christie and Zell and their friends were galvanised in 1961 by the publication of a science fiction novel, which would become a classic of the genre, Robert A. Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. A former US Navy officer and naval engineer who had been discharged for health reasons just before World War II, Heinlein started out writing work for the pulp magazines of the 30s onwards, creating exemplars of the so-called hard science fiction form, in many cases helping define science fiction concepts such as time travel and the militarization of space. As a result of his interests in both SF fandom and fringe politics, he did mix with some interesting people in the 40s, including Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard. Parsons, a literal rocket scientist, member of the Manhattan Project, and convert to Crowley's Thelema in 1939, knew Heinlein from the Manana Literary Society, which met in Laurel Canyon, California during the war, and was primarily composed of science fiction fans and writers, including Leigh Brackett, who would later co-write The Empire Strikes Back. Through the Manana Society, Parsons struck up a friendship with Hubbard, a prolific pulp writer at the time. This relationship ended with Hubbard taking Parsons' wife, yacht, and many of his ideas, which became part of both Dianetics and Scientology, and then Parsons' mysterious death in a laboratory explosion. Heinlein, meanwhile, became one of the leading lights of the SF genre through the 50s in both the pulps and the newly invented paperback books, which were bringing fiction to a wider group of readers for mere pennies. When the teenage Lance Christie first read Stranger in a Strange Land, he described the experience as being seized with an ecstatic sense of recognition. It was as if I had found in completed form the ideas which I was trying to gel into my own. Stranger tells the story of Valentine Michael Smith, a human child abandoned on Mars and raised by the native Martians in their culture and beliefs. Key among these beliefs is a bonding ritual involving the sharing of water, with the catchphrase, "May you never thirst," and the concept of grokking, to understand something so completely that you become part of it. On his rescue and return to Earth, Smith is first bewildered by human society and then tries to integrate his Martian perspective with human beliefs and mores into a religion he called the Church of All Worlds, with far-reaching, and for Smith, tragic consequences. The combination of this outsider perspective on human belief systems and Heinlein's espousal of many libertarian points of view caught the group's imagination. They, in turn, took the fictitious religion Heinlein had created and combined it with their own political and psychological interests and the burgeoning interest in pre-Christian beliefs, and they formed their own version of the Church of All Worlds. Aside from Heinlein and the interest in Wicca and supposed European pagan history, another key influence on Christian Zell's circle was one Kerry Thornley. Thornley was a former US Marine who served in Korea with Lee Harvey Oswald and would later be accused of involvement in the Kennedy assassination. In 1958, in a bowling alley in Yorba Linda, California, the birthplace of Richard Nixon, he and a fellow pothead and contributor to the libertarian atheist magazine The Realist, Greg Hill, had a shared vision, or at least they say they had a shared vision, of the true nature of theological reality. That in a world as beset with madness and chaos as ours, it made no sense to worship a male deity of rules and order, that the more useful deity would be Eris, the Greek goddess of discord and chaos. And so, the Discordian Society, later to become famous in the Illuminatus novels, was born. Writing as one of his many Discordian personas, young Omar, Thornley contributed work to a newsletter of one of the Carista spiritual communes of the time, in which he made the second of his notable contributions to modern mysticism. He coined the term paganism. In his piece, he wrote, "Let us look at the jobs of the far less intellectual but far more constructively functional religions of old. These were the pagan religions, the religions which survive to this day in England and the United States as witchcraft, groups which both stabilised and overthrew the social structure," also describing paganism as an institutionalised cultural counter-trend. Concepts he cribbed from Margaret Murray, Robert Graves' The White Goddess, and others. Although some of the Gardnerian groups were referring to pre-Christian worship in Europe as pagan, the word meaning forest dweller or someone who does not live in the city, originally an ancient Roman term of abuse for the rural common folk, the modern usage seems to have arisen solely from Thornley, and it was rapidly popularised by the Church of All Worlds and their associated groups. Meanwhile, the Church of All Worlds was evolving, absorbing many influences, including some from the Discordian side of things. The Church was defining a set of beliefs which required no dogma, accepting various mythologies as having spiritual worth, including fictional ones. The Church once described science fiction as the new mythology of our age. The Church itself had grown from its initial group, or nest, of 100 or so people, to a dozen nests across America, all with deep connections to the science fiction fan world and to its parallel Renaissance fair gatherings, which strove to create an authentic-seeming simulation of an idealised historical life. These nests were also connected by the official church magazine Green Egg, whose influence on paganism worldwide was considerable. One influence that was rapidly absorbed into the church's combination of myths was a new science fiction TV show called Star Trek. It's hard to appreciate nowadays just how unusual Star Trek was at its time. It not only showed a relatively mature human society with non-white and non-male figures of authority, but also used the format which creator Gene Roddenberry had originally pitched the networks as Wagon Train to the Stars, to tell a series of socially relevant metaphorical tales. It also introduced a philosophical concept which strongly influenced the Church of All Worlds, IDIC. It stands for Infinite Diversity in Infinite Combination. The concept, and this triangle within the circle symbol, first appeared in October 1968 in the third season episode, Is There in Truth No Beauty? Idic as a philosophy is easy to state, and like all such philosophical perspectives, rather hard to practice than describe. The quote from the end of the episode sums it up nicely. The glory of creation is in its infinite diversity, and the ways our differences combine to create meaning and beauty. This idea that there was everything to gain in the consideration and embrace of alternative meanings and perspectives, that difference is a treasure, not a threat, became integral to the Church of All Worlds, who had been formally chartered as a religion in the United States, the first Earth-based religion to do so, on the 4th of March 1968, a few months before this episode aired. There's a certain irony and aptness in this, because Idic was created by Roddenberry and inserted into the episode for one reason, not to stimulate the discussion of non-dualistic philosophies or to symbolically question the status quo of the 60s, but to try and sell a range of licensed Idic merchandise. The Church of All Worlds, the Idic philosophy, and Discordianism are all good examples of a concept which, though not defined until the early 21st century, is worth noting here as it begins to become manifest, that of hyper-real religion. The term hyper-real religion was coined by the Australian sociologist Adam Possamay and draws on the work of French postmodern theorist Jean Baudrillard. Possamay's current definition of hyper-real religion is a simulacrum of a religion created out of or in symbiosis with commodified popular culture, which provides inspiration at a metaphorical level and or is a source of beliefs for everyday life. Let's unpick that unwieldy little sentence. A key aspect of postmodern theory, especially post-structuralism, of which Baudrillard was a leading light, is that in modern society, symbols have attained such importance that they have actually overtaken the things which they are symbols for. Baudrillard emphasises this particularly in his essay Simulacra and Simulation. Here he draws a distinction between simulation, copies or symbols of something which actually exists, and simulacra, copies of something which either no longer has a physical world equivalent or never existed in the first place. His view was that modern society is increasingly emphasising or even completely replacing the simulation with the simulacra, the actual being displaced by the never real, and that the simulacrum is never that which conceals the truth. It is the truth which conceals that there is none. The simulacrum is true. The term hyperreal derives from this perspective. He defines it as the generation by models of a real without origin or reality. The novelist and philosopher Umberto Eco later put this more succinctly, saying that the hyperreal is the authentic fake. Although Baudrillard did not specifically discuss religion in this context, Possamay's use of the term fits broadly into Baudrillard's view that modern society is, if you'll forgive my pun, symbol-minded. The other key word in Possamay's definition above is commodified. It's a key aspect of post-structuralist thought that the main cultural aspect of modern society is its origin in a time period which has almost completely succumbed to the viewpoint of neoliberal concepts around value and trade, an era usually referred to as late capitalism and dating from roughly the end of World War II. The late capitalist era is defined by the power of multinational corporations, globalized markets and labour, increased concentration of financial speculation, and most significantly here, mass consumption. In the late capitalist world, pretty much everything can be defined or co-opted as a commodity, as product. And that's the thing about pop culture. It's bought and sold. And it's this easily available aspect of it in combination with the Western world's emphasis on individuality and choice, thoroughly reinforced by neo-capitalistic practices, which allow hyper-real religion to bloom. The one aspect of postmodern thought which has most thoroughly leaked into the overall modern mindset is the undermining of the grand narrative concept, the long-standing belief that there is one true truth which underlines all aspects of a given society. While this has possibly led to the clash of civilizations strife which dominates so much of the geopolitical landscape, it has also given the scope for individuals to seek their own defining narratives and faiths. As Possamai puts it, in this consuming world, the individual becomes his or her own authority. The postmodern person in the West no longer tolerates being told what to believe and what to do. He or she is faced with the proliferation of spiritual, religious, philosophical knowledges, which he or she researches and experiences. This personal seeking for truth is manifested in a variety of ways. For some, it allows them to find new and vivid metaphors for their existing beliefs. For others, it can give them the chance to move beyond the beliefs of their kin and tribe to find other beliefs, or, of course, to reject belief as a concept entirely. And it can bring some people to find or even create a whole new range of faiths, based on the stories they find within pop culture and speculative works on spirituality, which were both increasingly common in the 50s and 60s, and also increasingly cheap to own. If there's one thing we can say with certainty about the human mind, it is that it has a core deep hunger for narrative. It is in stories we have always found and transmitted our truths, probably from as far back as we've actually had language. It is clear that on some levels, our minds react nearly identically to a story as to that which the story is about. Whether or not the story happens to be, for want of a better word, true, doesn't matter for the most part. And these days, there are so very many stories to choose from. There is a fine line between the growth of a mythology and its outright invention, not least because all the hyperreal beliefs have necessarily drawn on older mythologies for the mystical and philosophical approaches. For example, the Buddhist and Taoist roots of the Jedi Knights in Star Wars. Certainly, paganism and fantastic fiction continue to be closely bonded, a tendency which manifested more and more in the mainstream from the 60s onward. 70s British television in general, and especially children's programming, had some remarkable science fiction and paganistic fantasy ideas, ranging from the teenage psychic wish fulfillment of the Tomorrow People to such occult-tinged works as Ace of Wands, The Changes, and the Avebury-filmed Children of the Stones, all of which drew a lot of viewers into their first encounters with pagan ideas. And in 1973, there was the film The Wicker Man, which brought many of these pagan historical myths and annual festivals into a bitterly funny movie, where the burning alive of a policeman is the only possible happy ending. The 70s were an especially fecund time for the hyperreal religions, not least for the considerable growth in what has become known as the New Age movement. Possamai regards this aspect of popular mysticism as an offshoot of the human potential movement, whose roots he traced to the sensitivity training of the 1940s and which found wider acceptance in the 60s. Although the human potential movement was at its core a secular and humanistic one, aspects of its philosophy of the deliberately directed self-improvement of humanity filtered into the stream of imported Eastern spiritual ideas in the 60s, becoming part of a popularised transcendence narrative. The various forms of New Age spirituality, ranging from the less explicitly mystical forms such as EST training and biofeedback procedures, and the positive thinking self-help practices ranging from neuro-linguistic programming to The Secret, and the more outright occult-tinged flavours such as white light paganism, pastel-coloured angel worship, and so on, all have a common denominator. They're all mass-produced, heavily marketed, and designed with as much as an eye to commerce as to any personal enlightenment they may lead to. They are product, and as such, the exemplary hyperreal religious practice. Possamai notes of the New Age adherent: they consume products for gaining and enhancing sensations. They can visit a New Age healing centre for a few days, participate in a vision quest and be initiated into shamanism, buy crystals and indigenous paraphernalia, learn astrology. These objects for sale, books, tarot cards, crystals, CDs, aromatherapy products, have long lost any taint of the demonic and have become common products. Adding, that the New Age spirituality is the consumer religion par excellence. There is considerable overlap between the pagan and New Age cultures, as anyone who's been into a crystal shop or mysteries down the West End could tell you. This can seem ironic considering how many pagans identify with opposing capitalism, although it can also be seen as a form of guerrilla warfare by pagans and mystics against capitalism, taking its materiel and using it for its own ends. 1979 saw the publication of two massively influential non-fiction books, Starhawk's The Stardance and Margaret Adler's Drawing Down the Moon, the latter including a detailed history of the Church of All Worlds, which was continuing to thrive. Both of these broadly accepted the Gardner Murray historical myths of paganism and emphasised the feminist influences. These were, in turn, influential on a novel, which is the introduction to pagan concepts for a whole generation, Marion Zimmer Bradley's 1983 work, The Mists of Avalon. Bradley, a practising Wiccan, brought her beliefs, especially the feminist aspects, to this retelling of the Arthurian mythos, and it also led to a resurgence of interest in fantasy fiction. The same year also brought Brian Bates' fictional interpretation of so-called Celtic myth, The Way of Weird. Drawing heavily from Carlo Castaneda's allegedly non-fiction 1968 bestseller, The Teachings of Don Juan, whose story would later transpire to be almost entirely invented by Castaneda, Bates brought 60s New Age sensibilities, Wiccan beliefs and Norse mythology together into an accessible and moving novel, which again was many pagans' first entry to the religion. Another fiction which inspired many people to their first discovery of the possibilities of paganism was the 80s TV show Robin of Sherwood. Created by Richard Carpenter, who had previously explored the crossover of science fiction and fantasy with the children's 70s series Catweasel, the tale of an 11th century hedge witch teleported into the 1970s. Carpenter's retelling of the Robin Hood myth was unafraid to embrace the darker aspects of the history of its setting. For example, its Will Scarlet, who was played by young Ray Winston, was a traumatized sociopath. But it was especially innovative in its consideration of Robin Hood as a pagan figure. Key to this was Herne the Hunter. A combination of the Cernunnos myth with the legend of its namesake, Herne was shown to be a shaman, possessed by the horned god, and sent to guide Robin to serve the common folk of Albion. Despite vicious retaliation by the likes of Mary Whitehouse and other Christian fuddy-duddies who are aghast at this heathen display on children's programming, the show ran for 3 seasons. Other popular British fantasy works which were especially inspiring to many young proto-pagans and magicians, including myself, were the novels of the late, great Terry Pratchett, whose smart satires of the entire fantasy genre grew to encompass a compassionate and earthy consideration of pagan magic, with his formidable and grounded witches, Esme Weatherwax, Geetha Ogg, and Tiffany Aching. Modern paganism has spread widely from its origins, both geographically and in terms of the beliefs encompassed. Many variations have appeared. These include the lesbian separatist Dianic witches, the techno-pagans, who embrace modern technology in both their beliefs and praxis, and various forms of reconstructionist paganism, who go deeply into the known history and records of a variety of ancient pre-Christian forms, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Norse, and attempt to bring versions of these ancient rites back to life. The vast majority of them place vital importance on the authenticity of their history, but as we've seen, much of that history is erroneous and saturated with myth and cultural drift. And even the Reconstructionists will often forget that the mindset of those ancient practitioners was, by definition, very different from our own. Some, however, treat the past as a resource to be respected without needing to place all their faith in its authority. Among them is the comic book writer and practicing magician, Alan Moore, who has extensively explored the importance of the imagination in such matters. Moore's main theories about magic and our connection to the gods equate magic and art as essentially the same thing. Moore has said, there is some confusion as to what magic actually is. I think this can be cleared up if you just look at the earliest descriptions of magic. Magic, in its earliest form, is often referred to as the art. I believe that this is completely literal. I believe that magic is art, and that art, whether that be writing, music, sculpture, or any other form, is literally magic. Art, like magic, is the science of manipulating symbols, words, and images to achieve changes in consciousness. The very language of magic seems to be talking about art and writing as it is about supernatural events. A grimoire, for instance, a book of spells, is simply a fancy way of saying grammar. Indeed, to cast a spell is simply to spell, to manipulate words, to change people's consciousness. And I believe that this is why an artist or writer is the closest thing in the contemporary world you are likely to see to a shaman. I believe that all culture must have arisen from cult. Originally, all the facets of our culture, whether they be in the arts or sciences, were the province of the shaman. When that enchantment is the creation of gods and the creation of mythology, or the kind and the practice of magic, what I believe one is essentially doing, Moore said, is creating metafictions. It's creating fictions that are so complex and self-referential that for all practical intents and purposes, they almost seem to be alive. This would be one of my definitions of what a god might be. It is a concept that has become so complex, sophisticated, and so self-referential that it appears to be aware of itself. We can't say that it definitely is aware of itself, but then again, we can't really say that about even our fellow human beings. Moore also stated, if gods and entities are conceptual creatures, which I believe they are self-evidently, then the concept of a god is a god. An image of a god is the god, a little closer to home. What Moore and others are saying is that it doesn't matter if your beliefs are based on something real or hyper-real. All of our connections to the wild forces of nature are filtered through our minds and our languages. As the Taoist philosophers noted, as soon as you try and put a god or mystical concept into words or symbols, something is always unexpressed. The Tao which can be spoken of is not the Tao. But these symbols, myths, and tales of the gods can bring us to a place where that inexpressible, numinous aspect can be manifest. So with all this in mind, let's look at those festivals again. Until modern times, there has never been a single society which celebrated all 8 of these holy days. Many of them are, if not clearly Christian or Judaic in origin, taken from ancient sources and traditions whose actual meaning and religious significance is not recorded. Ostara, for instance, is basically the Christian Easter and the Jewish Passover and has been celebrated as such across pretty much all of Europe. The stuff about the supposed goddess Ostara is taken from a single line from the Venerable Bede, and the bunny association was frank speculation by Jacob Grimm, which was repeated by folklorists until it was assumed to be fact. The cross-quarter days generally, though some of them had attendant folk celebrations, were as much tolerated as celebrated, as these were the days which tithes were collected on. As for midsummer, across the majority of the world, midsummer is celebrated primarily as the birth date of St. John the Baptist. The earliest reference to midsummer festivals comes from the 7th century St. Eligius, who warned the recently converted inhabitants of Flanders against the age-old solstice celebrations, while never specifying who or what those celebrations were for, saying, "No Christian on the feast of St. John or the solemnity of any other saint performs solstitia, summer solstice rites, or dancing, or leaping, or diabolical chants." A 13th century monk from Winchcombe in Gloucestershire recorded how St. John's Eve was celebrated in his time. Let us speak of the revels which are accustomed to be made on St. John's Eve, of which there are three kinds. On St. John's Eve, in certain regions, the boys collect bones and certain other rubbish and burn them, and therefore smoke is produced on the air. They also make brands and go about the fields with the brands. Thirdly, the wheel which they roll. The rolling, burning wheel, a symbol of the sun, was essentially a fortune-telling for a good harvest. If the flames went out before the wheel reached the bottom of the hill, the harvest would be poor. One of the few times in all these mythologies where there actually was a fertility rite involved, though far from the golden bow's ideas of shagging in the fields to ensure good crops. In the late 14th century, John Merck of Lilleshall Abbey, Shropshire, said of midsummer, "At first men and women came to the church with candles and other lights and prayed all night long. In the process of time, however, men left such devotion and used songs and dances and fell into lechery and gluttony, turning the good, holy devotion into sin," which suggests that the revelry either became more boisterous after Christianity arrived, was pretty rowdy in the first place and only partly tamed by the church, or the people really will use any excuse for a good party. It is said that the bonfires of midsummer were partly to purify the air with their smoke and partly to ward away witches or dragons. In the case of the former, it seems an oddly ironic reappropriation of such fires, considering how many witches were supposedly burned at the stake, and in the latter, what use is a small bonfire against a giant fire-breathing lizard anyway? Nonetheless, the fires of midsummer are a constant aspect of the festival across the world. As for the association of midsummer and fairies, this comes almost entirely from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, and a more than cursory look at the text shows those events were set on May Eve, which, unlike midsummer, actually does have a deep association with the fair folk of legend. And the idea that Druids observed the sunrise and sunset at standing stones such as Stonehenge is, as noted earlier, another romantic invention of the fairly recent past. A far more British celebration of the day involved processions through villages and towns, many of them involving mock courts. A commoner was elected mayor of a region for the day, riding around the town on a donkey and giving speeches mocking the political norms of the time, and, as this is Britain, the mayoress who accompanied him as a man in drag. Nonetheless, the day has strong associations in the folklore of many countries with witchcraft and dragons and old gods, such as the Finnish weather god Ukko, and not only of fire, but water. The Iranian festival of Tiragan, which celebrates both a border treaty and the end of a terrible drought, is celebrated by songs, a feast, and people making their way to the rivers to splash each other with water. Though not at all Christian, the rite is Zoroastrian in origin. The parallels with baptism are obvious. The modern British midsummer has become dominated by the expression of the combination of various local folk festivities with the neo-pagan narrative. And, after some brutal police aggression over the right to do so in the 1990s, the modern heirs of those mythic pagans and druids can now salute the sun at Stonehenge on Midsummer Eve. Historical accuracy and hyper-real origins don't matter. This is what spiritual authenticity looks like today. Midsummer rituals were rituals of the peasantry, the common folk, the common clay, as they used to be called. And so, if we were to take the myths and actual history of the past and use them to create something which lets us manifest a connection to the gods and forces of nature which, though not necessarily historically accurate, is nonetheless authentic, what better substance to use than clay? Clay, of course, has associations with the creation of mankind in civilizations far broader than just the Abrahamic ones. The process of creating, moulding, and firing clay objects can also be seen as a manifestation of one of the most basic parts of the Western mystical and occult traditions, the four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Or, as modern physics would have it, the four states of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. Each of these is manifest on midsummer, the fires and the smoke, the crop-enriching water falling to earth. Each of these is called upon in the creation of a pagan magic circle. Calling the four corners is the term. And within clay, all four may be shaped and bound. One last myth. There is an African tradition of creating votive objects from the Bamanan people of West Africa. These are called boli, and they're made from layer upon layer of clay around a central figure, either human or bovine in shape. The actual figure is considered to be too sacred to be seen directly, so the boli are covered in layers, which, as one observer described them, are impregnated with sacrificial materials over time: spit, urine, and human excrement, chicken and goat blood, women's menstrual cloths, chewed cola nuts, beer, palm wine and other alcohol, butter, millet, porridge, antelope horns, tusks, porcupine quills, animal hair, bird skulls, jawbones, feathers, fibres, cotton, wood, bark, tree roots, herbs, grasses, organic materials, nails, precious metals including gold, mirrors and amorphous, unidentifiable and undocumented material bundles are added to the surface. The body becomes more amorphous with each initiation origin, obscuring its original form and taking on a shape of its own as materials accumulate and morph into a thick patina. The same could be said for all our beliefs and cultures and the artwork which comes from them. We shape our minds and the things our minds and hands create. We work them over and over, infused with our sweat and blood, the shining and shitty parts of our lives. Each layer takes on a patina, and deep within are the unseen gods and forces, unknowable, untouchable, more present in negative space than the matter surrounding it. To worship the object alone is to miss the point. It is the making of it that matters. What remains may just be a symbol, but a symbol is as close as we can ever get to describing the divine. Thank you. In most of the practices which I've been following and writing about for a terrifyingly long time at this point, one of the constants is that people who have a singular belief system find it very, very hard to accept things from outside the belief system. And that's understandable. They have a very strong, rigid, codified set of rules by which they perceive their entire universe. That's how they interpret it. That's their entire symbol set. And anything that comes from outside it, it's hard to comprehend simply because they don't have the language for it. It normally takes, in the terminology of writers such as Tim Leary and Robert Anton Wilson, a neurological shock to shake people up out of their religious beliefs and to consider the possibility that there is something outside of those concepts. Sometimes this can become just a really random thing. You read the right book, you see the right movie. You realise your sexuality doesn't match with what your church tells you it should be. And these offer a point of mental softness where a new idea can start to dig in. So sometimes people can go from one belief to another and accept that quite cheerfully. It's very common, particularly in Americans, to find very fervent pagans who used to be very fervent evangelical Christians. What they've done essentially is changed the language but kept the actual procedures of their belief pretty consistently. But beyond those, it's the point where you consider the possibility that a third belief system might have something relevant to it. That when you start considering the idea of maybe, as opposed to the dualistic yes, no, us, them kind of concepts that most religions insist on. One of the things heavily influenced by the Illuminatus books, which appeared earlier, is a subset of modern occultism called chaos magic. That kind of sprung up in the mid-late 70s. Group of writers and practitioners in London and Leeds were starting to contemplate the idea of a multi-model approach to occultism, that within the context of a ritual, they set up a ritual space, they put up symbols to various deities, and during that procedure, they would believe absolutely in that deity. I've sat in on chaos magic rituals of immense power, from everything from the Hindu god Ganesha to Star Trek. And I've seen them produce, at least as far as you can tell in magic, some kind of actually measurable result. So that dichotomy is, there's the whole thesis, antithesis kind of thing in most people's head. It's like, but this is true. This must be absolutely true because it's my beliefs and it's what I've been told, and that's how the universe looks. But they can be synthesized into the idea of, well, hang on, if I just treat that belief system as if it's real, not as real, and do that for a while, and then step back from it after being quite fervent and try and take on, obviously you can't, but you attempt a form of objectivity where you look back on the results and you say, okay, well, when I was doing this ritual for Ganesha, all of a sudden hundreds of people I was passing in the street seemed to be smiling at me, and it was all very nice, and I kept finding pomegranates lying around because pomegranates are sacred to Ganesha, and all these synchronicities start to occur. This goes back to dear old Aleister Crowley, whose one of his major teaching techniques was to get his students to fervently devote themselves to God and to worship it absolutely with all their heart until they had, from their perspective, a genuine manifestation of that God. At which point they had to stop dead, pick a new God, and start again. And after you've done that 3 or 4 times, the concept of God starts to look a bit iffy. So yeah, as I say, in a lot of people that tension is continual, and it's something that self-examination continually has. But a lot of people actually synthesize that by going into this kind of non-dualistic third state of treating things as maybe.